So we're going to talk about pseudoscience tonight. It's the title of the book, Nonsense on Stilts, How and Why, that's not in the title, to tell science from bunk. This has been an interest of mine for a number of years. My first career was actually as a scientist, as a biologist. And my very first job was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville as an evolutionary biologist. You can imagine what that means, that half of my students were creationists. And in fact, some actively told some of their colleagues not to listen to what I was saying because otherwise they would go to hell. And that's a little of a challenge to teach evolution in that kind of environment. So that's what got me interested in pseudoscience in the first place. And then it turns out, of course, the pseudoscience is much more than just creationism. It's all sorts of stuff. And some of it actually is pretty dangerous, as we'll see, as we'll talk about tonight. Now, this talk is not a summary of the book because the book is 300 pages long and we only have like 40 minutes, 45 minutes. What I'm going to try to do is to give you 2 or 3 of the main themes, hopefully provide enough food for thought for discussion, then we'll just open up for a Q&A because I think the discussion is the part that is more dynamic and more interesting. So let me see if I can advance this thing. Of course not. Uh-oh. Oh, it's not on. That would explain it. Thank you. Oh, look, that's nice. It's a nice color. Okay, so let's start with what exactly is the problem here. Why are we here tonight talking about this stuff? Well, the basic problem from a sort of intellectual point of view, from a philosophical point of view, if you will, is how do we tell the difference between these two things? You got astrology on one side and astronomy on the other side. Or you could have evolutionary biology on the one side and creation science on the other side. Or you could have medicine and alternative medicine. You can have all sorts of couples that you want. But let's talk about for a second astrology and astronomy. How do you know that the first one is a pseudoscience and the second one is a legitimate science? After all, it's a complicated matter. If you're not an expert in astrology, for instance, you might not be able to tell the difference between the two. It may very well be that the astronomic community is actually making up a lot of stuff, and they get a lot of money out of their research without actually doing anything of value. That actually is, in fact, what is the charge that is raised against climate scientists, for instance, right? That there is money into climate science. That's why there is these worldwide hoax about climate science. So the fundamental question is, how do we tell the difference? And we'll see in a couple of slides that it's not that easy. If you compare extremes like these, I think it is fairly easy. I apologize for anybody here who believes in astrology, but I think this is one is easy. The problem is that a lot of other cases, things are not easy at all, and that's actually where, of course, it gets interesting, both in terms from an intellectual perspective and also from a practical perspective. The second question is, why should we care? Okay. Why is this an issue that we should be talking about, and I think everybody should be thinking about? Well, I think there is at least 3 reasons. The first one is, as some of my colleagues often put it when they asked, why do you work on this thing, is because it's intrinsically interesting, which basically is a fancy way to say it just interests me. I have an interest in this thing, therefore I think it's intrinsically interesting. But a better way to put the point is there is an intellectually interesting question here. There are major human activities that involve millions of people, and some of these activities appear to be problematic from a point of view of epistemology, from a point of view of knowledge, of theory of knowledge, and others are not. So you might imagine that a number of people, including scientists themselves and philosophers, particularly philosophers of science, which is what I am, would be sort of interested in the question in the first place. But I wager that there are not many philosophers of science in this room tonight. So the question is, why would anybody else care about this stuff? I think there's 2 answers for that. First, I don't know if you noticed, but science costs money, a lot of money. And most of that money is taxpayers' money. A lot of research, of course, a certain amount of research is privately funded, but a lot of research, especially in the United States, the overwhelming majority of scientific research is actually paid for by the public. taxpayers. And so, I'm a taxpayer. I'd like to know where this money is going and what is it been doing with it. For instance, right now, the fundamental physics community is having a really interesting, serious discussion about whether to build the next large particle accelerator. Right? The current one, the largest current one, the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland is operating fine, but it's reached the capacity, the limit of what it can do. Physicists want higher energy, and higher energy means much larger particle accelerators, and much larger particle accelerators cost billions of dollars. So let me tell you a little story about this. Turns out that the United States had a chance to build a Large Hadron Collider and passed it. A number of years ago, in fact, the preliminary work was done in Texas. They dug a big hole to eventually put the collider in. The hole itself, in dollars from 20 years ago, cost $1 billion to build, to dig. $1 billion. So then Congress got in and said, hey, why are we doing this thing? And so there were hearings in the Senate, and a prominent physicist, Steven Weinberg, was invited to these hearings to explain to the senators why is it that we needed these large colliders, particle accelerator. And there was this interesting exchange between a senator and Professor Weinberg. The senator said, the problem with Professor Weinberg is that I have to explain this to my constituents, and people don't eat quarks. Quarks being fundamental particles that the collider was going to study. And so Weinberg paused for a second, pull out a piece of paper, did a little calculation, pretended to be a little calculation, make a calculation on the spot. And he said, actually, Senator, by my calculation, every one of your constituents eats a few billion quarks every morning for breakfast. Because, of course, everything is made of quarks. So, of course you eat quarks. That did not go well. It was funny, but it didn't get the funding. So there's really serious questions. And right now, the fundamental physics community is in trouble because they assume, of course, some of them at least, assume that, yeah, of course we're going to build, the international group of, nations is going to build the next collider. But in fact, when they ask, well, why should we spend this kind of money, they're kind of fuzzy about it. They're not sure what exactly is going to come out of this thing, and therefore they have a hard time explaining why. So one reason to understand the difference between science and pseudoscience, which includes or involves a better understanding of the nature of science itself, is because science costs money. It's not cheap. Okay? Philosophy is cheap, but science is not. So you should hire a bunch of philosophers instead. The third reason, this is a really practical one, is because pseudoscience actually harms people. At least some pseudoscience harms people. Since I got into this business of pseudoscience, and I've been told several times, why don't you just let it go? What's the harm if people believe in astrology, pick up an horoscope in the morning, and read the horoscope? Well, there is no harm, not much harm, if that's all you're doing, and then you not act on it. Although apparently, Nancy Reagan did act on it and advise her husband on the basis of her astrologer's advice. So I don't know. But some pseudoscience is actually dangerous. That's an example over there. That is a woman featured a few years ago on the cover of Mothering magazine. You can see here, well, maybe you can if you're in the back, probably not. She has a big tattoo thing here that says, big sign that says, no AZT. AZT is the class of antiretroviral drugs that is most effective against HIV/AIDS. And so she was pregnant and affected by AIDS and refused to take the drugs because she believed in a pseudoscience that claims that there is no connection between HIV and AIDS. You want to guess what happened? She and her baby died. Right? So, and this is actually something that has killed millions of people around the world. For several years, for more than a decade, the South African government bought into the same kind of pseudoscience and refused to distribute AZT drugs to its population, which resulted in at least several 100,000 people dying that might have been saved. So, there are some practical issues here that we might want to consider. So, the reason we should be careful is because it's intrinsically interesting. Science costs money, pseudoscience kills. Or at least potentially kills. Now, we're going to stay on this for a while. because this is about the most complex diagram I'm going to show you tonight. And it is my attempt to try to make sense of the science, pseudoscience, quasi-science, maybe science, maybe not science continuum. I think it is a continuum. And the way I'm going to organize things for discussion later is this. So imagine that you have these two axes, one of which measures the sophistication of the theoretical understanding of a particular discipline. I'll explain what that means in a minute. But broadly speaking, how sophisticated the theory actually is. And over here, some kind of measure of empirical knowledge, how much empirical data there is supporting that theory. Okay. Those are the two components of science, or the two basic components of science. You don't do science unless you have a theory, a general hypothesis about how the world works, and unless you have empirical evidence that supports that. Right? So let's start with the simple cases. I showed you earlier astrology. I think astrology is down here, somewhere, in this corner, together with a bunch of other things. That is, the theoretical understanding, the theoretical content is close to zero. I mean, there is a theory, but the theory is incoherent, it's very simple, and it doesn't really match up with anything else that we know from science. And the empirical content is also very low, close to zero. Because when people have actually done experiments on astrology, they have, people have done actual experiments to see if astrology works. They've shown pretty clearly that it doesn't. One of my favorite was a number of years ago. It was published in Nature magazine, which is the premier international scientific journal. And this guy asked a few hundreds of the world's most prominent astrologers if they were willing to do this experiment. They were going to be given sets of 12 psychological profiles, and they were going to be asked to match them with astrological signs. They agreed to do it on the theory that, of course, if there is anything to astrology, at least statistically speaking, they should be able to do better than by chance, okay? In matching the profiles with the signs. You want to know more or less what the result was at the end? What were the chances of a good match? 1 in 12, which means essentially by chance. So you could have had the same exact kind of match if you just threw these profiles in the room and then picked them by random and put them into boxes. So there's very little empirical content, very little theoretical content. Opposite extreme, particle physics, the queen of sciences. Incredibly high theoretical sophistication. Quantum mechanics and general relativity are the two most successful scientific theories of all times. There's no question about it. I can say that as a biologist. I'm not a physicist, so I'm not biased here. And their empirical content is incredible. Both theories have been tested over and over and over for more than a century. And every time there have been spectacular successes on both sides. I mean, it's incredible. There's not a single piece of information, data that actually contradicts those theories. And in particular, quantum mechanics can make predictions to many, 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 many decimal points of precision. It's just an incredible theory. So there is a very high theoretical sophistication and a very high empirical content. Okay, those are the easy ones. The problem is the stuff here. And of course, this stuff here is actually the more interesting stuff, because there we find psychology, economics, sociology, scientific approaches to history, evolutionary psychology, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course, you also find things like parapsychology, for instance, the research on telepathy and clairvoyance and things like that. It's also somewhere in between here, right? And that's where the problem starts and becomes really difficult. So let me give you some examples. Oh, you might have noticed that string theory is on here. String theory, of course, is the most debated current theory in fundamental physics. Right? This is the notion, I'm not a physicist, so don't quote me on this, but this is the notion that the universe fundamentally is made of vibrating strings that vibrate at different frequencies, and depending on the frequency of vibration, you get the appearance of particles such as electrons, quarks, and things like that. It's a beautiful theory. Very high theoretical content, because it actually builds on quantum mechanics, so it's really high, very sophisticated from a theoretical perspective. In terms of data, not much. It's down there, meaning that it has very little empirical content. In fact, according to my colleagues in the physics department, string theory has not made a single empirically verifiable new prediction since it has been proposed about 40 years ago. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means we don't know. We can't figure that out. We have no way to figure it out, okay, at the moment and for the foreseeable future. So does that make it pseudoscience? No, it doesn't, because it builds on quantum mechanics, which is certainly not a pseudoscience. Does it make it really good science? I don't know. I mean, some people, some physicists and some philosophers of physics now are beginning to say that we should test string theory with post-empirical approaches, which makes me nervous. What is a post-empirical approach? It is an approach that does without the data. And in my mind, if you start doing science without data, you're going down the wrong direction. So string theory is over there. Let's pick on SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, definitely not a pseudoscience. I mean, the basic premise is pretty reasonable. It's a large universe. So it's very likely that there are going to be other sentient beings, intelligent beings out there doing something. But are there? That's an empirical question, of course. So in terms of empirical content, SETI right now is exactly at 0. Because although we've been searching and listening to extraterrestrial signals since the 1950s, we found exactly 0 potential candidates for intelligent signals. That doesn't mean that the galaxy is empty. In fact, my preferred theory there is that it's that the problem is on the theoretical part. SETI research assumes that the extraterrestrials more or less have a human psychology. Right? That they're interested in communicating, that they actually build civilizations capable of radio communication, that they're going to use radio, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if human psychology is any indication, we got a problem. Because in the last 60 years, almost 70 years, that SETI has been operative in the world, we have listened a lot. I mean, countless hours. You can actually, for fun, you can actually download the SETI Institute screensaver, which will turn on when you're not using your computer, download data from the SETI Institute and actually analyze data on behalf of the SETI Institute. Who knows? You might be the lucky one that actually sees the signal for, before everybody else does. I've had it for years on my computer. The problem is we've been listening for like countless hours. We've logged tens of thousands of hours of listening using a variety of radio telescopes. How many times you think we have actually attempted to communicate, to send a signal? Once. Back in the 1970s, from the radio telescope at Arecibo in Puerto Rico, which is the largest standing radio telescope in the world, Carl Sagan and a group of other astronomers designed this famous signal that was sent out. Why once? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it costs money. Much more money to send a signal than to receive a signal, because to receive a signal, you just have to listen. You just have to have the radio telescope. To send a signal, you have to use a lot of energy, because the signal degrades, obviously, in space, so little by little, so you have to use a lot of energy. In fact, they use so much energy during that particular burst at Arecibo that they destroyed all the windows within a radius of several kilometers when the burst went on, and they had to pay for it. So there's money. Also, it doesn't pay off. The signal was sent to the M13 global cluster, which is a large, massive group of stars, about 100,000 stars, right outside of our galaxy. It's going to take several thousand years for the signal to go there, to get there. And if somebody's going to respond immediately, it's going to take several thousand years for the signal to come back. Carl Sagan has been dead for already a number of years. There's no payoff. There's absolutely no payoff in doing that sort of stuff. So, if our behavior is in fact indicative of other extraterrestrial intelligences, then everybody's listening and nobody's talking. Well, there's going to be lots of years like that. It's like, hey, is anybody there? And nobody's actually sending out a signal because it doesn't pay off. It costs money and there's no payoff. Now, does that make SETI a pseudoscience? No, not really. It does make it a very questionable kind of way of spending your time. Right, and your money, but hey, I've seen worse, right? So that's what it gets interesting, where you get into these situations, or these borderline situations. Not to mention, let's say, economics. Now there, a lot more interesting things, more important things hinge, I shouldn't say more interesting, but certainly more important things hinge on that one than SETI, right? Because economists are highly regarded in the world. They actually make decisions about how to run basically countries and things like that, and at the global level, at the planetary level. So this is important. Turns out, however, that economics itself, like a lot of that other social sciences, suffers from serious problems. It's got some developed theory, but that theory doesn't seem to match very well with empirical data. In fact, not at all. So the ability of economists to make successful predictions in the long term is close to zero, even though they won Nobel Prizes for it. So you would think that's a serious thing. You get the Nobel Prize usually for serious things, except that people win the Nobel Prize for peace, who have done nothing about peace. So I don't know about that. But it's a serious business. People's lives hinge on it. The world economy literally hinges on it. And yet, one can argue that the connection between the theoretical understanding and the empirical basis of economics, it's like shaky at best. Things are changing in the field as a result of that. Classical economics is in crisis, has been in crisis for a number of years, and now there's new approaches, one of which is behavioral economics. Because guess what? Some economists figure out that human beings are in fact human, meaning that we make decisions not based on full knowledge and completely rational decision-making procedures, but because our friends told us this thing, or because we're afraid of stuff, or et cetera, et cetera. So that maybe bringing in some psychology is a good idea. Sounds wonderful, until you realize that psychology is also in trouble. If you actually read the psychological literature over the last decade or so, you might have heard of what is called the replication crisis. Replication crisis is this situation that apparently, it turns out that between 1/3 and a half of papers published in major psychology journals, results published in major psychology journals, are not replicable. When people try to replicate those results, they don't get anything. You might imagine that's a problem. That's not what happens in quantum mechanics. Okay? Every single experiment that replicate quantum mechanics. There's no question about it. So that's too bad, because in fact this includes even some major findings that made it into the textbooks. Right? You go to college, you study psychology 101. You study some of this stuff, and this stuff, it turns out it's actually out of date because it's not replicable. There's some of them that it's just too bad. Like for instance, one of my favorite was the study a number of years ago that argued, empirical data in hand, that how you should behave on a date. So they found that if your date is holding a cold drink in her or his hands, he or she is going to respond coldly to you. And while on the other hand, because it's influenced at a subliminal level, the temperature of the drink influences her reactions. I'm going to say her because I'm a man, heterosexual man, so you make your adjustments, because I don't want to spend the rest of the evening say him or her or they, etc. You get the point, right? Vice versa, if she's holding a hot drink, turns out her feelings for you are kind of warm and the date is going well. Wouldn't that be interesting? Right? It's too bad that it's not true. I mean, that would be very easy to manipulate. First of all, I don't actually get this thing, because that means that every time you go to a bar and you order a cocktail, then the date is not going to go well. If you go to Starbucks, on the other hand, and hold a cup of coffee, horrible coffee, then things are going to go well. It's like, that's not my experience. I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem right to me. But it turns out it's not right. It turns out when people tried to replicate it, they didn't find the effect. And this is just one of many, many examples. Again, the question is, does that mean that this makes psychology a pseudoscience? No, but it does make it a far more fallible science, a far more fallible enterprise than certainly anything that appears over here. Not just physics, but even evolutionary biology, molecular biology, chemistry, even climate science and things like that. So it gets complex. And there is no simple answer. Parapsychology, doesn't appear here, but it should be somewhere over here. And the reason for that is because parapsychology is very low in theoretical content. In fact, it probably should be over here. But it does have some empirical content. There's a lot of research on parapsychology, particularly on telepathy, but also on clairvoyance, the ability to see the future, and telekinesis, the ability to move objects at a distance, right?
And remote viewing.
Remote viewing is a similar, yes, that's right. There's a number of things like that. By the way, anybody here believes in telekinesis? Damn, because I would have asked you to move my arm, to ask my arm. But apparently nobody's buying it. All right. So parapsychology is interesting because for a number of years, research on parapsychology has been done in major research universities. 2 major parapsychology labs were active for several decades at Duke University and at Princeton University. These are not minor little places, right? They're not minor leagues. And these things were funded at the tune of, several hundred to a few $1 million. They went on for a long time. Finally, a few years ago, both labs were shut down for lack of results. And everybody claimed a win. The people that were running the labs claimed that they were shut down because they showed conclusively that telekinesis is real, and that's it, we're done. And the people that shut down the labs, on the other hand, said, no, we shut them down because they showed nothing after several decades. Your pick. I tend to lean on the second part. But the problem with parapsychology is not that it's not testable. Right, so one of the issues here that comes up often is the issue. Let me bring it up. It's the issue of falsifiability. So there's this notion that is common even among scientists that for a theory to be scientific, it should be falsifiable, meaning that there ought to be a way, at least in principle, to show that it is wrong if it is in fact wrong. Right? That's not going to do it, because almost all of these things are falsifiable. Astrology is falsifiable. In fact, I just argued a few minutes ago that it has been falsified. People have done the experiments, and they've shown that it doesn't work. That's falsifiability. But it's still a pseudoscience. String theory is not falsifiable at the moment, but that doesn't make it a pseudoscience. It just makes it something that we cannot check at the moment. It's an interesting idea that we can't check. We don't know how to test it, but that doesn't mean it's a pseudoscience. So what is it that makes it a pseudoscience then? If it's not falsifiability, what is it? I think what it is the notion that if an idea has been tested over and over and it has failed the tests, and that is true for astrology, it's true for HIV denialism, it's true for anti-vaccination hypothesis, it's true for a bunch of these other things. If it has been shown very clearly and very consistently that it doesn't work, and people still think that it does work and keep doing it and keep practicing it, that's what qualifies as a pseudoscience. Not the fact that it's a wrong idea, because the history of science is full of wrong ideas. That's how science works. Science makes progress one wrong idea at a time, by eliminating one wrong idea at a time. Nor is it the case that it's, it doesn't hinge on falsifiability. It hinges on the fact that once that people agree, a community of people that work on this thing agrees that it doesn't work, then it should be let go. Very few situations like that happen in science. When scientists realize that something is not working, at some point they're going to let it go. Not immediately, because scientists are human beings. They might not think of it themselves that way, but they are human beings, so they all want the same things that human beings want, particularly fame, glory, money, and things like that. Sex, also. So individual scientists might not let it go. I mean, there's plenty of examples in the history of science where individual scientists had not let go an hypothesis, even though it had already been disproved significantly. In fact, Max Planck, the physicist, famously said that science makes progress one funeral at a time, because people had to die before the next generation comes in, and with fresh ideas. But astrology has seen thousands of funerals, and it's not going anywhere. And this thing has been around since the Babylonians. So that's a lot of funerals, and it hasn't changed. Okay, so that gives you an idea. I mean, we may want to come back to this diagram after discussion, but this gives you an idea, I think, of the complexity of the thing, of the landscape, and of why it isn't possible, except in very simple cases, to just say straight out that something is a pseudoscience or something is not a pseudoscience. So, so how do we determine this if we are regular people who don't actually know quantum mechanics, let's say, or string theory, or something like that? If we're taxpayers and we have to vote on the next, collider, on what basis we're going to make that kind of decision? Or on what basis are we going to make the decision to vaccinate our kids or not? How do we individually figure this thing out? Turns out this is actually an old problem. First of all, for every expert, of course, there is an equal and opposite expert, especially on television, right? But for every fact, there is not necessarily an equal and opposite fact. That's American economist, interestingly, Thomas Sowell. Or, to put it as one of my favorite philosophers did, George Carlin, I have as much authority as the Pope, I just don't have as many people who believe it. Right? So the question is one of trust, it's one of authority. Why do you believe certain people rather than others? Why are you going to make a decision based on certain people's opinions rather than others? As I said, it's an old problem. You know it's an old problem if Socrates talked about it. It's 2,400 years old. That's pretty old as a problem, right? So there's a beautiful Platonic dialogue. Actually, in my mind, all Platonic dialogues are beautiful. So let me rephrase it. There's a Platonic dialogue called the Charmides, where Aristotle gets where Socrates gets into exactly this problem. I'll read you the bit of the dialogue. This is an excerpt from the Charmides. There's Socrates, and then there is another guy. And you'll see also how the famous Socratic method actually works. Let us consider the matter in this way. If the wise man or any other man wants to distinguish the true physician from the false, how will he proceed? So he's talking about medicine versus pseudo-medicine, already there. Right? Vaccination versus anti-vax, or something like that. He who would inquire into the nature of medicine must test it in health and disease, which are the sphere of medicine, and not in what is extraneous and is not its sphere, right? So it's just say you got to test it within the proper domain of expertise. The other guy says, true. Socrates. And he who wishes to make a fair test of the physician as a physician will test him in what relates to these matters. Other guy, he will. Socrates. Socrates goes on. He will consider whether what he says is true and whether what he does is right in relation to health and disease. He will. Socrates. But can anyone pursue the inquiry into either unless he has knowledge of medicine? This is a crucial question. How are you going to test medical claims if you yourself don't have medical knowledge? And the other guy says, you cannot. Socrates. No one at all, it would seem, except the physician, can have this knowledge. And therefore, not the wise man. He would have to be a physician as well as a wise man. Other guy, very true. This is a very good example of Socratic dialogue. Usually the dialogue works this way. Socrates talks, and somebody else says, indeed, Socrates. You're right, Socrates. I had never thought about that, Socrates. That's the dialogue that goes on most of the times. But you see what the problem is. So this applies to medicine, but it applies really to pretty much anything. Socrates basically is saying, look, it doesn't matter how smart you are. He's talking about a wise man, somebody who actually has knowledge about all sorts of things, but not medicine. Well, if you have knowledge of all sorts of things, but not medicine, that doesn't make you competent to actually talk about medicine. This is what I call these days, the Nobel syndrome. I don't know if you've ever noticed how somebody wins the Nobel for, let's say, particle physics, and then all of a sudden they talk about how to solve the world problems and bring peace to the world, and what about the economy? It's like, wait, hold on, you won the Nobel Prize in particle physics. What kind of competence do you have to talk about all sorts of other stuff? Well, I won Nobel. Oh, well. Then we're good. Right, so that's the problem. So I'm now shifting the problem from a philosophical matter of, how do we tell the difference from a philosophical perspective between science and pseudoscience to a practical matter. If I have to trust somebody, how do I decide whether I should trust my doctor or I should trust Jenny McCarthy? It's a good question. You laugh, but it's a good question. All right. So let me introduce Alvin Goldmans' 5 tests for a trustworthy expert. Alvin Goldman is a philosopher who has thought long and hard about this kind of stuff, and he came up with this kind of 5 questions that you should ask yourself. These are very practical. You might want to take a picture of this, of the coming slide, because they're actually very practical. Or buy the book. Because they're... You notice how that was smooth, right? Yeah. Okay. So the first thing you can do, of course, is the obvious one, right? You can examine the arguments presented by the alleged expert and her rivals. But that runs into Socrates' problem, right? So if I see somebody going on television and talking about evolution and creationism, I am, in fact, in a position to do just that. I'm an evolutionary biologist. So I can tell, no, the creation is full of crap. The other guy is actually saying something that makes sense. Fine. If I were a physicist, then I could tell the difference between, a physicist and somebody who argues against, the Large Hadron Collider. But if you're not, then that's the problem. So you can do this only if you're, in fact, an expert. If you want to think about something more sort of accessible, imagine that you had to fix your car. How do you decide where to bring your car to be fixed? Well, presumably you're going to ask an expert. Unless you can fix the car yourself, so unless you're a mechanic yourself, however, you don't actually know who is a good mechanic and who is not a good mechanic. That's why you're going to start asking other people. That's why you're going to go out, on reviews and things by other people and things like that, because you don't know. You don't have the proper expertise. You run into the Socratic problem here. Oh, I didn't want the whole thing there. Okay. The second suggestion is to look for evidence of agreement among experts. Because if they're actually experts, and if there actually is an agreement in the field, that's a pretty decent indication that things might go that way, might actually work out that way. There is nobody in the physics community who doubts quantum mechanics. It's a good indication that quantum mechanics is a solid theory. There's a caveat, of course, there, because somebody might say, well, wait a minute. Isn't it the case that 2,000 years ago, every astronomer agreed on the Ptolemaic theory, and it turned out to be wrong? That's right. This is human nature, my friends. This is I'm not going to give you a guaranteed answer with truth with a capital T. All I'm saying is, if you have to put your money where your mouth is, you're much more likely to win a bet if you bet on expert consensus than if you bet against it. Sure, once in a while, expert consensus is going to turn out to be wrong. And then you win big. But most of the times, you don't. Again, think about the car example. If a bunch of mechanics tell you, look, the problem with your car is the brakes, and you say, well, but my dentist says otherwise, I think you're going to be better off going with the mechanics and their consensus than with your dentist, or even with the occasional mechanic who disagrees. Third, look for evidence that the expert is, in fact, an expert. You notice that when you go to your mechanic or when you go to your doctor, you'll see a bunch of diplomas and things like, accredited by, Columbia University gave me this degree. Why do they do it? It's not just because they paid a lot of money for the university, Columbia University's degree. It's because they want to show you that they know what they're talking about. They're credentialed by serious institutions, right? They studied, they did their work. That's why you trust them. This is not difficult to do, especially in these days of online searches. But if you just watch a debate on television, I don't know if you notice, but a lot of these these screens where there are 6 people talking simultaneously or 9 people talking simultaneously, often you only see their name expert, followed by expert. Expert in what? Who gave him that expertise? Or, even worse, if you go downstairs and you pick a book in certain areas of this bookstore, these wonderful bookstores where you should buy a lot of books, but some of their books actually have the name of the author followed by PhD. Careful. If you have to write down that the author is a PhD and the book is usually about psychology, why do I have to show my credentials so obviously? And so it's like it's trying to attract you to things that you might not want to be attracted to. So you need to be careful. You need to check whether the expert is in fact an expert. That doesn't guarantee that the expert is right. It just guarantees that he's an expert. Fourth, investigate what sorts of biases the expert may have. We're all human beings. We all come with biases. If anybody says that they don't have biases, they're bullshitting or they're fooling themselves. We all come with biases. We all have some bias or another. Most of the times, we don't even realize it. You know how to know that? Because the psychological research shows that that is the case. That creates a problem, doesn't it? Considering what I told you about psychology. But okay, fine. We have biases, right? So that's why people who are skeptical, quote unquote, I call them denialists of climate change, will say, oh, it's all about the money that the climate scientists are getting. Sure, if you're a climate scientist and you put in, research to get a grant funded, yeah, you need the money. Although the money, I don't know if you guys know this, you probably do, but the money from grants doesn't go to the scientists, it goes to the research. It's not like the scientists are getting the millions. They might get a summer salary if they're lucky, but the money goes to the research, not the scientists. Besides, if you actually follow that trail and you see where the big money is actually going, it's not going to the scientists at all or the scientific community at all. It's going some other directions, like the oil industry, for instance. That's where the big money is. But that in and of itself doesn't settle things. Once you figure out that somebody has biases, that doesn't automatically disqualify that person as an expert, because everybody has biases. So you just have to weigh how much you think those biases are actually going to play in that particular case. It's not always easy. And finally, check the track record of the expert. Everybody can claim to be an expert. There's one famous financial advisor, for instance, on television that had been around for a number of years who has been discredited in an incredibly obvious way by none other than Jon Stewart years ago on The Daily Show. And yet he's back on television selling suggestions to people on how to invest money. So the question is, does he have a good track record? The answer is no, not in that particular case, at least. You want a good track record, right? If you go to your mechanic again, and your mechanic the first time doesn't fix the car, say, well, all right, mechanics don't always fix cars. Some cars are unfixable. But if you keep going back, and every time he doesn't fix the car, at some point you're going to change mechanic. At some point you're going to say, whoa, hold on. I'm wasting my money here, right? On the other hand, if you go to a mechanic over and over, and every time you get a problem, he fixes the problem, then that's a reliable mechanic, so you keep going back. So the idea is that you do these 5 checks in however way you can do them. The first one you might not be able to do at all, but the other 4 are available. So let's put this into practice and answer the question, should I vaccinate my kids? So what you're going to see appearing here are the same 5 criteria that Alvin Goldmans put forth, and then how Jenny McCarthy, famous anti-vaxxer, for those of you who don't know her name, is going to stack up against those criteria, and your physician.
She was a centerfold.
She was a centerfold, so she's an expert in certain things, that's for sure. I wouldn't want my physician to be a centerfold, for instance. Arguments. How are the arguments stuck up? Jenny McCarthy famously says, my science is my child, which sounds really romantic, and it's complete nonsense, however. No, your child is not science, because science doesn't work that way. Your physician, presumably, if he or she is a good physician, has looked at dozens of studies, not done dozens of studies, because usually physicians, general practitioners, don't do the studies themselves, but has looked at dozens of studies that have in fact found no connection whatsoever between vaccines and autism. None. Not a single study. After the initial one that claimed that there was a connection, and I'm sure you know, that initial one was retracted because it turned out to be fraud. All right. 1 for your physician, 0 for Jenny McCarthy. Second, agreement among experts. No, yes. The experts agree with your physician. You should vaccinate your children. They certainly don't agree with Jenny McCarthy. Well, that was easy. Is the expert an expert? No, yes. If your physician is a legitimate physician, then she knows what she's talking about. She knows what vaccines are, how they work. She knows the literature, or she's supposed to know the literature if she's a good physician. I see no evidence whatsoever that Jenny McCarthy actually understands anything about vaccines. Is there a bias? Well, here's a split kind of judgment, because Jenny is well-meaning, for sure, I assume. I mean, I don't know her personally, but I assume that she's well-meaning. She has a well-meaning concern for her child. However, she's possibly also, into fame. I mean, after all, she was originally doing a kind of career that hinges on fame, on being a celebrity, and probably has a sense of mission, a feeling of a sense of mission. A sense of mission actually is a very powerful motivator for people. If you think that you're doing something really important for other people, like saving lives in this case, you might be completely going for it without actually any backing of empirical data. For instance, let me give you another example. You might have noticed that there are a lot of psychics in the village. I still don't know how the hell they pay their rent, by the way. And I have my occasional fun with psychics. That sometimes in the summer they sit outside, and then you pass by, and this woman says, "Would you like me to read your future?" And of course my answer is going to be, "Shouldn't you know that? You're the psychic, right?" Now, that said, most psychics are not frauds. They don't do it in order to get your money, although they make a living out of it. But they don't do it for that reason. A lot of psychics are actually convinced that they do really have powers and they can help people. Okay. The way it works, it's actually through something called cold reading. I know this because psychology says so. And where people are, some people are very good at reading other people from the way they dress, from the way they talk, from little mentioning of things here and there during the session, and so they can tell you actually a significant amount, a lot of stuff that you're surprised. And it's also the result of the psychics' work because there's another known bias in psychology, which is called I don't remember actually what it's called, but it's basically a selective memory. So you will remember the hits and forget the misses. Right, so when the psychic is talking to you, she will say 10 things. And then of those 10 things, 2 will be more or less correct. And you remember those after the session. The 8 that she completely missed, you forget them because they're not relevant. They don't come to your radar screen. So she might be well-meaning, and she might actually even have a sense of mission. Now, your physician possibly gets money or incentives from Big Pharma. It's very likely. These days, physicians do get money or incentives in the form of vacations and things like that. Your conferences in unlikely places for a conference like Hawaii, things like that. So yeah, there might be some bias here. Now the question there is, well, does that bias overrides these other criteria? Is it enough to override these other criteria? That's up to you to make that decision. I don't think so, but it's up to you. And then finally, track record. None versus long practice of the profession. It seems to me pretty clear here that even with the consideration of biases on the part of your physician, the thing is pretty overwhelmingly in favor of listening to your physician, vaccinating your kids. You can apply this approach to everything that you care enough to actually want to come up with some assessment. Don't do it all the time, because otherwise you're going to spend your time, looking at these things and filling out tables and saying yes, no, maybe, and that sort of stuff. But if it is something important, if it is something that you actually want to make a decision, informed decision about, it might actually be a good idea to write down this table and start making serious efforts to actually fill in the things. It's going to take you a few hours to do it if you use a search engine. But it might work. Well, it does work. Now, so far I made a sort of empirically based, rational argument for why it's a good thing to be skeptical of pseudosciences, and it's a good thing to accept, broadly speaking, scientific consensus, although there are exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. All that sounds very reasonable, I hope. And yet, there's plenty of people, like millions of people in the world, that just don't budge. There's lots of people who go to the astrologer. There's lots of people who go to the psychic. There's lots of people who don't vaccinate their children, so much so that now, both in the United States and in Europe, we have new breakout of infectious diseases such as measles because people don't vaccinate their kids. So why? If I made such a good argument, in the book it's like 300 pages long of an argument. If I make an empirically based, data-based, reasonable, logical argument and all that sort of stuff, why is it that I don't get to convince people? Turns out another philosopher of more than 2,000 years ago had the answer, had figured out the answer, and we're still not paying sufficient attention to him. That guy was Aristotle. That one over there. Aristotle wrote a very important book on rhetoric. And rhetoric is an art that these days is kind of not particularly looked favorably upon. It's not taught anymore in most universities. It used to be taught in universities. And in fact, when somebody says, want to dismiss something, you say, well, that's just a rhetorical trick. To imply that people that engage in rhetoric are actually tricksters. They're trying to pull something on you that without your knowledge. But in fact, rhetoric is the art of persuasion, of intelligent persuasion, according to Aristotle. Aristotle figured out, because he was a good intuitive psychologist, that when we're talking to human beings, data and reason are not enough. You have to have them, but they're not enough. He thought that in order to reasonably persuade somebody, you have to have three components, what he called the logos, the ethos, and the pathos. The logos is what we've been talking about for the last hour. That is, you want to have your logic, your reasoning, your data right, or as right as possible. Okay? You want to make a good effort to make sure that your arguments are good arguments and your data is good data. Because if you don't, then you really do become a trickster. Then you really want to pull something over other people. But so you have to make sure, in good faith, that you've done the best of what you could possibly have done in terms of logic and reasoning and data. But that in itself, Aristotle says, is not going to get you anywhere. That's the necessary but not sufficient condition. What you also need is ethos. Ethos is a Greek word that refers to character. You have to show your audience that they can trust you, that you're a reasonable authority, trustworthy authority about that particular thing. That is not, by the way, got to do just with showing that I have a PhD or that I have the diploma from Columbia University or whatever it is. That's part of what ethos is. But it's also a question of, can you trust me personally, not me as some genetic guy who has a PhD from the University of so-and-so, but me personally. Is there some good reason why you should trust me? Do I look trustworthy? Do I come across as trustworthy? Do I talk in a trustworthy fashion? So you have to make that kind of connection with people. Otherwise, people being people are not going to listen to the logos. And finally, you need the pathos. Pathos is, of course, the root for pathology, but it's also the root for emotions. That was the Greek word for emotions, the ancient Greek word for emotions. And so that means that you have to actually make a connection with, an emotional connection with people, and a connection with their beliefs. Let me show you an example. Let me tell you about an example that I learned about when I was debating creationists back in Tennessee, which is something that I don't recommend, incidentally, to most people. So one of my recurrent opponents was a guy named Duane Gish, who at the time was the vice president of the Institute for Creation Research, so-called. And so we debated 5 times over a number of years. And I noticed the first time that we debated, he came on stage. This was a huge audience. This was the University of Mississippi. And there were like 2,000 people in the audience, right? The first thing that he does, he starts talking about football. I was a scientist there, going there prepared with my notes about evolution and stuff. Why is he talking about football, particularly the local football team? Because he was signaling that he was one of them. He was interested in making a connection to the audience, right? So the ethos. What about the pathos? The pathos worked because most of those people, mistakenly I think, but still, most of those people believed that if they accepted the notion of evolution, they would go to hell. Because that would deny the existence of God, and that would mean that that turns them into atheists, and therefore they're going to hell. Now, going to hell is a fairly strong emotional pull to reject a belief. If you're seriously convinced that you're risking your soul on accepting a particular scientific notion, I guarantee you there's no amount of logos that's going to convince you that that is the case. So Duane Gish did write the ethos and did write the pathos. Of course, he got the logos wrong. I got the logos wrong, but I had no pathos or ethos in that particular case. So guess what happened during the debate? Right. Now, I got him eventually, a couple times later, because he showed the slide at one point, which had a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, a very well-known evolutionary biologist who died a few years ago. And the quote read like Stephen Jay Gould did not believe in evolution. I looked at the quote and I said, that's not possible. That just doesn't compute. I know Gould. I read a lot of his stuff. I corresponded to him. That doesn't sound right. But of course, I had no idea where that quote was coming from. So what did I do? I just wrote down the quote, got home, did a little search, found the quote. Turns out that the quote ended, the original quote ended with a comma, after which there was a phrase to the effect of, but obviously nobody believes that. So I made a note of that, and I made a slide of that. Because I said, you never know. It might come useful. A few months later, we meet again. Now, Dwayne Gish was a professional debater. He did like 200 debates a year, okay, almost every day. So he had always the same presentation. So he comes in, and he shows the same slide. And I said, God just delivered us to me. Because I put out the slide with the complete quote. And he got upset. And he said, well, I can't quote the whole book. I said, well, I know, but maybe not just stopping at the comma right before the guy says, and nobody believes that. That might have been nice. And I left it at that. He immediately lost the trust of the audience, completely. Several people after the talk came to me and said, look, I still don't believe your logos. They didn't use that word, but I still don't believe evolution. But I'm seriously disturbed by the fact that Dr. Gish had to lie in order to get his point across. So it's important. The ethos is important. Now, when I explain this to my science colleagues, they just don't want to hear it. Because we are trained to think in objective ways, in terms of the logos. If I have my facts straight, and if I have my argument straight, that's it. In fact, I actually heard more than one colleague say, oh, what's the problem in debating a creationist? You just go there, prepare, you're a scientist, he doesn't know the science, you go there and you explain it, and that's it, done. So have you ever done it? Because that doesn't work that way. We all need, not just scientists, we all need to get into our heads that Aristotle was right. If you want to talk to somebody, I'm talking about your next Thanksgiving dinner with the relative who has crazy ideas about all sorts of stuff. There's only two strategies there. One, do nothing, which is probably the best strategy. Just keep drinking your wine and hope that the dinner is going to be over as soon as possible. But if you really have to engage, don't go for the logos, because you're not going to go anywhere. Go for these other two components. Try to make an emotional connection with that person. Say, well, why exactly is this person believing this stuff? Why is he so invested in that kind of belief? And what can I do to undermine the belief that way? Because the facts, I know that I'm right, but the facts are not going to move him. We are human beings. Human beings don't work just by rationality. If we were, then we would just work like computers. You could just say, Siri, do you believe in evolution? Of course Siri believes in evolution. Well, Siri doesn't believe in anything because she doesn't have beliefs. But nevertheless, that's the way we work. Okay. This is important because a lot of the wasting of energy and time and resources that we have in debating people and talking, I'm talking not just about scientific discussions now or science versus pseudoscience discussion. I'm talking about anything. If you want to talk politics, good luck. Yes, you do have to have your logo straight again, but if you don't make the other two connections, you're not going to get anywhere. And look what this country is at the moment, right? Because we don't pay attention to the other two components. We don't pay attention to Aristotle. We should. Thanks very much. So we have plenty of time, I think, for questions, comments, whatever it is. Yes, and then yes.
Should I wait for the mic?
Oh, I don't know. Is there a microphone? Yeah. There is a microphone. It's going to be thrown to you in a moment. How good are you at catching microphones?
In my old age,
Okay, so I just want to ask about the paradigm of what science is and all of this. So we know that in quantum mechanics, and particularly things like entanglement and that sort of thing, just basically it doesn't make a lot of sense to people. It's not an intuitive thing. So therefore, there's just so much we don't know, and of course paradigms change and all that. So there are people who say, that actually, like science should not only be about the physical. There should be like a consciential paradigm or something where consciousness is paramount. And there's a lot of literature on out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, and some people claim there's actually a lot of research being done if you know where to look. So I'm wondering what you think about that, because on the one hand it looks like, oh, it's just pseudoscience because it's very different than what we study in the physical sciences or even like behavioral psychology or something like that. It's very different. But I'm wondering how open you are to things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually just wrote, that's interesting you mentioned near-death experiences, because I just wrote a preface to a book that's coming out in Italian, however, on near-death experiences. And so I actually, it's pretty fresh in my mind because I read the whole book. How open am I to these kind of things? I'm open, but as Carl Sagan famously put it once, you want your brain, your mind to be open, but not so open that your brain falls off. Right? And so it's really, but it's not easy to figure out where that line is, because of course plenty of people got burned on both sides of that divide, right? Sometimes people are a little too open-minded, and then they start getting all sorts of, buying into all sorts of stuff that's nonsense. But on the other hand, you also do have situations where scientists or a scientific community has resisted a notion for a long time. For instance, continental drift. Right? Geologists resisted the notion of continental drift for decades until they were kind of forced by the evidence to sort of to agree. The theory of evolution itself, even though Darwin was very successful very early on, still we had for decades people, especially in the United States, scientists, not just people, scientists, especially in the United States, denying, rejecting that notion. So there's no hard and fast rule. That was a big part of showing you that diagram that has no sharp boundaries anywhere. There's no hard fast rule. So we would like to talk about specifics. Now, if we're talking about near-death experiences in particular, I think that there are very reasonable alternative sort of materialistic explanations for those experiences that have to do with lack of oxygen of the brain under those conditions, and therefore we know that those kind of conditions generate hallucinations. People have checked, by the way, because what happens under these situations is that people seem themselves outside of the body and look at their own body, and they claim that they hear things that they couldn't have heard otherwise, or seen things that they couldn't. And some people have actually done experiments on that. It turns out that's actually not the case. They don't see anything that wasn't that they hadn't seen before. But it's okay to remain open-minded. If somebody publishes a serious number of studies, I'd say a serious number of studies and not one study, because the problem with one study, so somebody just a few days ago on Twitter sent me this paper published in a psychology journal arguing that there is evidence now for telepathy. And I said, ha, gotcha. What do you think now? Did you change your mind, skeptic? I said, well, it's one paper. Right? And it's in psychology, which I just argue 1/3 to a half of the stuff is actually not repeatable. So it's like, okay, hold on, that's an interesting thing. So the first thing I did was I called some friends that work in the field and said, you guys read this paper, I assume? Yes, we've read the paper. What's going on here? It's like, well, we're working on it. So it's okay to be open-minded, meaning that nobody should reject this stuff as a knee-jerk reaction. Right? If somebody comes up with a peer-reviewed paper that argues that there is such a thing as telepathy, I'm going to be skeptical, because I think telepathy is problematic for a number of reasons, including that it doesn't fit very well with either neurobiology or current physics. But hey, it's possible that neurobiology and current physics are wrong at some level. So,
but wait, I just want to ask you a related thing.
Then we have to pass the microphone. Yeah.
So subjectively, like say you either had a spontaneous like OBE yourself, or you had a lucid dream and you studied some stuff about this, and from a lucid dream you then had an out-of-body experience and you actually went and saw something which appeared very real, which maybe you would verify like for yourself. So separate from science and you know, an intersubjective experience, like
Right.
you had your own experience, like wouldn't that be a powerful sort of event?
It
to
certainly
affect you?
would. It certainly would be powerful on an emotional level. But the question is, you know, if I try to be a sort of reasonable person, I would have to question my own, you know, emotional reactions. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with the specifics that you're talking about. So I'm often asked, so you're an atheist, by which I mean, I'm not asked, I am an atheist, so that's a question, not a question. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I'm an atheist. I don't have a positive belief in God. Right? I don't know that there is no God for a fact, but I'm an atheist, just in the same way in which I'm sure most of you are a-unicornists. Right? You don't believe in unicorns because you haven't seen any unicorn, you don't see any reason to think that there are unicorns, and so on and so forth. But it's possible that there are unicorns. So the question is like, you know, so you're an atheist. How would you react if you walked out tonight of this place and all of a sudden the stars rearranged themselves and said, "Hi, Massimo, I'm here"? My response is, shit, that would be a really powerful experience, after which I would first of all check with my friends how much did I drink tonight. And second of all, if the experience persists, I would check myself in a psychiatric hospital. Because, you know, that's the most like. Now, if it turns out that everybody else has the same kind of hallucination, it's on CNN or whatever network you trust for whatever reason, well, then now I'm going to start having serious doubts, right? So the first what I'm saying basically is that the first reaction should be a conservative one. Scientists tend to be conservative, not politically conservative. They tend to be conservative in the sense of their first reaction is, nah, toward a new notion is not likely, not likely to be the case. But not likely doesn't mean impossible. Not likely doesn't mean it's never going to happen. So, can we have the second question? Yeah. And then over here, right? Did you have? Oh, yes, these two.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks
Yeah.
for the talk.
Thank you.
So how do you define a trustworthy expert? I know you had a slide up there, but it seems like there's always going to be like a ton of subjectivity to that. For example, you know, is it based on education? You said don't trust the PhDs. Is it based on what they've published? A lot of these papers, you know, there's corporate money behind that, and even the peer-reviewed type stuff in college environments. You know, if it's a view that's seen as pseudoscience or something that's a little wacky, you know, you've got pressure for people who, you know, don't want to necessarily put their name on that based on their career, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like there's always going to be a ton of subjectivity, and just
yes, welcome to the human world, right? That's the problem. So if anybody expected tonight to pay the $20 for Olio and get a silver bullet, they would say, okay, tonight I'm going to come out of this and I'm going to be able to tell the difference between science and suicide. I'm sorry, you're going to have to ask for a refund because that's not going to happen. And the reason for that is, yes, you're right. We're talking about human activities, human subjectivity, particularly when it comes to trust, right? So that table that I showed you, I think it's very useful. But it's not a guarantee for you to get anything right. And in fact, science itself, of course, is not a guarantee to get anything right. It's only a question, you know, so the one way to put it is this. In the book, there's a chapter where I go into this in some detail. You may or may not be familiar with something called Bayesian statistics. And the Bayesian analysis is a very powerful type of analysis, which is now underlying a lot of stuff like, you know, search engines online and, you know, airport luggage delivery. I hope you didn't have any bad experience recently about that. But anyway, it's a powerful approach to essentially making decisions on a probabilistic basis. And very briefly, what Bayesian analysis says, there's a theorem here, and the theorem is absolutely correct. It's a mathematical theorem. Whether it works it's useful in practice for you or not, it's a different issue. But the theorem basically says that when you approach something, like let's say vaccines versus non-vaccines, right? So do vaccines cause autism or do not? Those are two hypotheses. You can treat them as two hypotheses. And when you start, you have some prior understanding, some prior estimate of the likelihood of each one of these being correct. Okay? Those are in fact called priors in Bayesian analysis. So I am a scientist, so for me, the vaccines work as high prior. So I think it's very likely that vaccines work, let's say 90% likely. And on the other hand, for the same reason, I'm going to say that the notion that there is a connection between vaccines and autism has a very low prior for me, let's say 10%. Right? The total has to be 100. Then data comes in. So new studies come in, right? And every time the new study comes in, I can update my priors. And so it turns out that initially, in fact, like 20 years ago, when the first paper came out, the one that turned out to be fraudulent, making a connection between vaccines and autism. Actually, at that point, my priors would have been significantly higher for the vaccine autism connection, maybe 30, 40%, which is significant. But then I was going to wait for the next round, and the next round, if the next round had confirmed the first findings, then that prior would have gone higher. If the next finding went against that, then we're going to lower, right? So the notion is that ideally, that's how we should reason, that we should take evidence, including evidence about trust, and keep sort of evaluating this thing and putting it up or down, lower or higher, depending on how the new information comes in. The only thing you don't want to do, and this actually goes back to your question, and there's a mathematical demonstration for why this is a bad idea. The only thing that you don't want to do ever is to put your priors at 0 or 100%. Because if you set your priors at 0 or 100%, I can mathematically show you that no new information is going to ever change them. That means you're close-minded. Right? So if I say I am absolutely 100% convinced that quantum mechanics is true, then I put myself in a bad box. I should be 99.99999%, but not 100. If I say I have 0 belief in possibility, that there is a God, that's putting myself into a box that I don't want to be in. I should put 0.0000001. But if new evidence comes in, you should be able to update things. But the update, the Bayesians will tell you, is subjective.
Okay, so ultimately your point is don't believe everything you hear, weigh the evidence independently, and
it's a little, hold on. Let me clarify that. It's a little more complicated than that because you cannot, in most cases, you cannot actually weigh the evidence independently. That's the problem, right? That's the Socratic problem. So if you go back to this table, weighing the arguments, sorry, not this table, the other table, the list, not really a table. Come on, stop it. There. Weighing the evidence independently, it's step number 1. If you can do that, well, yeah, good for you. But you have to be a doctor or a medical researcher in the case of vaccines, or you have to be a physicist in the case of quantum mechanics, and so on and so forth. And most of us don't fall into that category. So that one is it's unavailable to most people in any particular field. These other 4 tend to be more available. And so what you're weighing there is not the evidence of the claim, it's the evidence that whoever is making the claim is trustworthy. So there's a big difference there, right? So most of the times, we're not actually weighing the evidence of the claim. We're weighing the evidence that somebody that makes the claim is a trustworthy person. And that's all you can do. And yes, you're right, it's subjective, absolutely. Yeah, there's no, okay, so 2 over here in front and 1 in the back. 2 in the back.
In regards to the chart, the graph, do you think that these sciences and pseudosciences are constantly shifting due to the new technology? Because, I don't know how old this paper on hot and cold beverages and dating is, but it seems as though people now, psychologists now, wouldn't even think to kind of go towards that idea because it's silly. So do you think that do you think that would you see psychology slowly in the next upcoming years moving over to the other side with molecular biology and
No, that's a very good question, and the answer is yes and no. And I'm going to be a little bit more clear about this. So first of all, there should be a third axis here, which is time, because things do change over time. For instance, a number of pseudosciences, at some point back in time, they were actually considered legitimate enterprises. Very few people know, apparently, that Isaac Newton spent more time doing alchemy and biblical criticism than physics. What do we know Newton for today? For its biblical criticism? No. For his alchemy? No. For his physics. Why? Because the physics worked out, the other two were not particularly interesting, right? And alchemy in particular just went out. At the time, alchemy was in fact supposed to be, you know, it was treated by Newton as a science. It was no stupid, you know, it was not an idiot. But then Boyle came in and essentially established chemistry, modern chemistry, and it's like, okay, alchemy is out of the way. So if we had been having this discussion at that time, then alchemy would have been somewhere here, and then now it's over here, right? Now, if somebody makes a claim to be an alchemist and transmuting, you know, lead into gold, then you say, well, you're nuts. You're just down here, unless you have a really large particle accelerator, in which case you can transmute elements into each other. But it's going to cost you so much money that it's not worth it. So yes, there is a temporal dimension to that. Now, the interesting question is, A, what has happened in the past? Is there any trend, any interesting trend in the past about science and pseudoscience? And B, what's going to happen in the future, which was your question about pseudoscience. About psychology. So let me answer first the first question, because the past is easier to take a look at than the future, obviously. Right? So my friend Martin Baldry and I actually wrote a technical book about this stuff called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience, published by University of Chicago Press. And one of the things that we did was ask ourselves, so is there any case in the history of science where a notion, once that it has moved into this territory, is actually emerged back? No. We couldn't find a single case of that kind of stuff. We call it the pseudoscience black hole. Once that something becomes a pseudoscience, it doesn't come back. It just disappears in the black hole and then it stays there. At least historically, that seems to be the case. If anybody has a counter example, I'd be very interested. But we looked pretty hard in the history of science. We couldn't find anything. So that's an interesting thing, however, because it tells you that certain things solidify. Like, you know, physics has never been in danger of being a pseudoscience, not even since Aristotle. And it's definitely not going to go there. There's no way that's going to go there. Once you're in that territory, you're there. It seems like, to use a more technical term, that these things are attractors, stable attractors. Once you're down here, you stay down there. Once you're up here, you stay up here. The problem with psychology or economics or, you know, a bunch of these other things is that, A, it's difficult to tell which direction they're going to go. I don't think they will ever go into the pseudoscience. I honestly don't think that that's going to be the case. But I'm not willing to bet any money at all on them becoming something like quantum physics. And the reason for that, I don't think it has anything to do with the competence of the psychologist. It has to do with the subject matter. Right. So think about it this way. I mean, for all the respect that physicists really should be accorded, they literally study the simplest things in the universe. Quarks, electrons and things like that. They are the simplest objects in the entire universe. Psychologists study the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain. There may be more complex brains somewhere out there, but as I said earlier, they're listening, they're not talking, so we don't know, right? But it's the most complex by far, but like trillions of orders of magnitude kind of thing, right? The human brain is an incredibly complicated thing, and when you put a bunch of human brains together, you get into sociology, it's even worse, which is why sociology is even actually over here, okay? All hell breaks loose with sociology. So I don't think that's going to change. I don't think that, so I think that these fields are actually going to stay here. I mean, I could be wrong. This is an empirical question. We'll talk about it in a century, right? But I don't think it's going to go either that way because it's clearly not a pseudoscience. It doesn't have the makings of a pseudoscience. I mean, the basic data is, you can collect data fairly easily in these things. You can test hypotheses in a fairly straightforward way. The hypotheses are not crazy. They are consistent with one of the things that creationists, for instance, don't get is that a major reason to reject creationism is because if you reject evolution, you're not just rejecting evolution. You're rejecting also chemistry, physics, geology, astronomy. Just a bunch of stuff that goes in there. Because why would you reject evolution? Oh, because I don't believe in carbon dating. Which is not a kind of dating, it's geological stuff. Well, if you don't believe in carbon dating, now you don't have a problem just with the biologists. Now you have a problem with the geologists. Oh, I don't believe that the universe is, what is it, 13 billion years old. Well, now you got a problem with the cosmologists and so on and so forth. So the problem is that they are rejecting a large chunk of science. This is not the case here. Psychologists don't reject a lot. What they're doing is actually fairly congruent with the science. But I don't think it's going to move precisely because the subject matter is such that I can't imagine ever developing a quantum mechanical theory of the human brain. It's like not going to happen. That said, just because I can't imagine it, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So, or maybe that I'm short on imagination. Did you have a question? And then back there.
Yes, and I made notes because I have anxiety issues. First off, I think you're being incredibly humble by saying that you got into this because it's incredibly interesting and intrinsically interesting. It's intrinsically important. And I think the reason why a lot of people are here right now is because of the concerns about science and data and what it's been used for. So I applaud you for that, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. The alternative to falsifiability is verifiability, a stricter standard, and I think you're going towards that from what I understand, and I think that's in the current environment, as I've said, with the pseudosciences. I think that's probably a good idea. I'll echo what the young lady said over there about the reliance on authority. If I'm a Catholic, the Pope is a spiritual leader. If I'm a Republican, the leader of the strongest country in the world is, an expert on political economics. That concerns me. And then the final point, I think, is that your discussion about Aristotle, and I realize that the pathos and authority are important and necessary in terms of countering arguments at the dinner table at Thanksgiving or whatever. But I think that there's, over a long term, it's very, very important to focus on the logic and to be forthright and straightforward and elevate the discussion. And that's really what I've tried to do on social media and other places, is just to answer with accuracy as much as I can. So.
No, absolutely. And Aristotle will agree. Aristotle would say you start with the logos. Before you engage in any discussion with anybody, you gotta make sure, so much as it is possible, that you got your data right and you got your arguments right. Once that is done, then you can start talking to other people. There is, in fact, a chapter in the book which deals with something called virtue epistemology. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of knowledge. Virtue epistemology is the approach that says the first thing you should do is to make sure you got the right approach to knowledge, right? That you are honest doing your research. Let me give you a simple example. These days, one of the reasons I don't engage in a lot of online discussions, even though I'm very active on Twitter and Facebook, but I fairly rarely engage in actual discussion. So if somebody asks for a reference to something, then I'll give it. But long, protracted discussions, I don't do them. And one of the reasons for that is because these days, discussions boil down to somebody posting a link. Right, so I make a point, and somebody says, but what about this? So I follow the link, and it's a book. And so it's like, hold on. So you are asking me on Facebook, or on Twitter, even better, 280 characters at a time, you are now asking me to read a whole book, right? So that's a significant number of hours of my life that I should be spending because you, a stranger who I have no idea who the hell you are and why you're doing this, says that this is where I find the answer. I'm sorry, that's not the way discussions work. Imagine if you actually come back to your Thanksgiving, right? So imagine if your uncle says, hey, here's a book, read it before the end of tonight, and then let me know what you think. That's not going to work. That's just not going to be. I mean, it's fine to cite sources and say, look, if you're interested in more, go there. But if you're having a discussion, you have to have a discussion with me on your own terms. You have to make your points in the way in which you understand them. The fact that you're just because then it's easy. I mean, anybody can just Google it.
Can I just ask a clarification?
Again, thank you again.
Sure, quickly, because we have a couple people.
I mean, if you can't agree on the logos, can you even get to the pathos and the ethos components?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually think you can't. Well, Aristotle thought you can, because so Aristotle thought that people who disagree with the logos reasonably, because there's the same data can reasonably often be interpreted in different ways. There are different theories that make sense of those data. If those people actually have the ethos and pathos connection, then they are going to be looking at the thing in good faith, or in a better faith, if you will, than if they don't share that. So yeah, you can have reasonable disagreement. I mean, I've had experiences in my own field of research of genuine discussions, genuine disagreements with people where I looked at it and I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. I think you're right. So there are, people do change their mind. I mean, one of the things that we get from the current climate of polarization, especially political polarization, is we got this notion that somehow people just don't change their mind ever. But they do. Psychologists say so. There is evidence in psychology. People do change their mind. But people don't change their mind. So there are some trends that are pretty clear about how people change their mind. People don't change their mind if you tell them they're stupid, or you throw any kind of insult at them. They just don't respond well. People rarely change their mind on the spot. Even if you have a crushing argument and the person is intelligent and the person has got connection with you and all that, if he's invested in that particular notion, he's not going to change his mind on the spot. And you should never expect that. The way people change their mind is over a period of time with multiple exposures from different sources. Right. This is fairly well established. So if you hope to change people's minds, it's never going to happen on one-to-one, but that doesn't mean that a one-to-one is a useless thing to do. You're planting a seed. And that seed may germinate like 5 years later, because in the meantime, that person has been exposed to the same idea from different people and different sources. That's the way people typically change their mind, if it is something that they really care about and they have strong opinions about. If they're not attached to a particular notion, then yeah, you can change their mind. You can change their mind on the spot. But for things that matter, it's more difficult. Yeah.
Well, you kind of touched on what I was about to say, but it was about what my personal experience when I'm talking to people with belief systems. When you go talking about the belief system, makes them push their heels in deeper and like reinforce their beliefs. So is there a way that you can approach things in a teaching more cognitive thought and about implicit bias to kind of take away from the belief system part and have them start to get their wheels turning independently of what their beliefs are? I mean, that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And then two, is there also a way for science to maybe layman terminology, the vernacular, so that other people don't feel so threatened, so that it's a little bit more approachable for them?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So the answer to both questions is yes, but it's complicated, as usual. So first of all, yes, I do blame a lot of scientists and even science popularizers for the way they present science. It's really not good. I mean, my daughter, who is sitting right here in first row, is just taking a course. I won't tell you where, because otherwise it makes it too easy to identify the person. And the person, a scientist, introduced first lecture, the scientific method works this way. There's no such thing as a scientific method. There's a number of methods that work differently for different sciences. And for a professional scientist to go out there and talk to kids and say, the scientific method works this way, that's right there a pretty serious disservice. Those people should be mandated to take a philosophy of science course. So scientists are responsible themselves for some of this stuff. They come across as arrogant, often, talking down to people, using abstruse language. It's not good. There's very few good science popularizers, and usually they're not scientists. There are exceptions, but usually they're not scientists. And I can count them in the United States on maybe one hand. I think it's on one hand. Carl Zimmer is a good one, for instance. So I think he's a really seriously good science popularizer. He writes for the New York Times, but not many other people. Beware particular scientists who think that they know how to communicate, because that's not in their training. We don't get trained. We don't get trained to teach. We get trained to do research. If you do a PhD, you get trained to do research, not to teach. You might teach on the side because you have to make some money, but that's not training. They're just thrown in front of a classroom and say, "Hey, do something." The assumption is that because you have the knowledge, then you also know how to teach, which is a bad assumption. It's not a good thing, and you definitely don't know how to communicate to a larger audience. That takes effort, it takes experience, it takes humility to some extent, and so on and so forth, which are all characteristics that are kind of not very common among science. Yes, among scientists, they're not very good. So beware of scientists doing science communication, because there are exceptions, but a lot of times that's not going to work. Now, your first question, however, was about people. Oh, yeah, people changing their mind. So what we know about how people change their mind is not good. Because first of all, I mentioned a minute ago, it takes a lot of time, it takes repeated exposure, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that I know that also is interesting, it's relevant, but it's not particularly good news, is that typically people change their mind initially because they're exposed to a different notion by somebody they trust. So let me give you an example. Again, when I was in Tennessee, you can tell that Tennessee traumatized me. I mean, when I moved from Rome to Connecticut, people asked me if I had felt a culture shock, and I said, nah.
Welcome North Carolina, sir.
Yeah, right? And then I moved from Connecticut to Tennessee, and there was a culture shock. So one of the things I learned there, particularly because I had friends who were, for instance, agnostics or atheists, and yet they had grown up in highly religious communities like Church of Christ and things like that. And so I started making a habit of asking them, so what happened? How did...
I grew up Seventh-day Adventist.
There you go. So you tell me if this story sounds right. So I'm thinking about one particular story which I've heard repeated a number of times. So this person raised Church of Christ and very fundamentalist, goes to college, a fundamentalist college, Pepperdine University, okay, good college, but a fundamentalist college, fairly religious college. And she started making friends there, and then she went back home, and her preacher told her that all her friends were going to hell. She said, what? Why are they going to hell? Because they sing in church, and we don't. And her reaction was, this is bullshit. You're telling me that my friends, good people, have exactly the same beliefs that I have, but they sing, we don't. That's enough to send them to eternal damnation? I don't think so. So that was the wedge that started things. Now, 2 years later, she was at the library, doing research, and basically she abandoned the church, etc. So the beginning, the initial point, was not Richard Dawkins telling her that she held stupid beliefs. She wasn't listening to Richard Dawkins, right? Richard Dawkins is an enemy. So you don't believe a word of what he says. It came out of knowing people that had slightly different beliefs and started questioning at that level. Unfortunately, it seems that that's the case a lot of times, that people change their beliefs very slowly because of these kind of experiences. And so this notion that somebody with a PhD from Oxford comes in and says, well, you're obviously a bunch of idiots, don't you know? Yeah.
There's a way for even elementary school, starting at that level, they push a little more positive thinking.
Yeah.
Critical thinking, just so
Yeah.
that people can grow up to.
Sure.
They do have a strong belief system. It might be something else that does take that seed where they just dive differently.
Yeah, no, sure. By the way, the microphone made its way back because there were a couple of people there. Okay. Yeah, there is evidence that shows that is in fact the case, that kind of stuff helps. That, exposing, so for instance, there is an interesting book that has to do with very different kind of issues. It's called The Character Gap by Kristen Miller, I think, which has to do with morality, with teaching character, improving character and so on and so forth. And one of the problems that he finds at some point is that, of course, there are a bunch of cognitive biases and ways in which people just don't behave well, correctly, the right way, not because they're bad people, but because there's these biases. So one of the typical ones is the bystander effect. The bystander effect is a situation where if somebody feels sick, let's say, and needs help in the middle of the street, or a true case in the middle of a mall, somebody just had a heart attack, fell down on the floor. Everybody was around doing absolutely nothing, and the reason for that is called bystander effect, is because your immediate thought is, nobody else is doing anything. If I do something, I'm going to expose myself to a possible situation of ridicule. Maybe this guy is faking it. Maybe there's something else going on, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to do anything. The guy died in that case. But the evidence is that if you get a bunch of people and put them into a room and explain to them about the bystander effect, the effect goes down dramatically. From a 25% response to those situations goes up to 75% response. So once people are aware of biases, they actually pay attention. So there is evidence that shows that actually that kind of stuff works, but we don't teach it. We don't even teach it in college unless you take psychology courses. or critical thinking you don't teach it even in college unless you take a philosophy course. So yeah, I would think that if not elementary, certainly junior high school at the latest, that the kind of stuff should get studied.
And this will be our last question.
Yes.
Okay.
Make it good.
Sure. Well, thank you.
Pressure's on.
Thank you. It actually builds up what she was saying. I wanted your opinion more so on the American education system. And by the way, when you're talking about the pathos and logos and ethos, it reminded me in English class in high school, we studied Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail.
Yep.
It's a great case study, and he uses all three of those elements very well balanced.
Yep.
For anyone that wants to do some further reading. But if you had to pick, like, maybe within science, a particular subject that you think is lacking a gap in the American education system, maybe it's students that come to your classroom every day and you think, wow, how do people not know this? What's maybe the first one or two things that come to mind?
The first thing that comes to mind is the one I just mentioned, that there's no such thing as a scientific method. I think that what I would do actually, so lots of colleges, of course, every college has a course of science for non-majors, right? So if you're not a biology major, but you're a science major, you still have to take one course in usually intro biology or intro physics or intro something else. And it's a good idea in theory. Practice is horrible. It's a good idea in theory because, yes, you do want everybody to be exposed to something about science, regardless of what they're doing. And the fact that you're majoring in music or in economics doesn't matter. You should know something about science. That should be part of literacy, just in the same way in which Shakespeare should be part of literacy. Nobody, even in the sciences, should graduate without knowing Shakespeare, having read Shakespeare. The problem is that it's done in the most horrible way possible because nobody wants to teach those courses. Right? No scientists, no professional scientist faculty with a tenure track or tenured wants to teach those courses because they're boring. Because the first of all, nobody wants to teach intro courses. Usually, you give them to adjuncts, right? Which basically means slave labor. And of the intro courses, the worst are the non-major courses because you know that those people are not going to stick around. They're not going to actually be in your major in the next few years. So nobody wants to teach them. And the way they're taught is as a watered-down version of the standard 101 course, which is an awful idea because what is the sense of, the only time that I'm exposed as a student to science, I get this watered-down version of biology? What does that do to me? Nothing. It's probably, in fact, going to make me hate biology in particular and science in general for the rest of my life. The way these things should be taught is as a science appreciation course. They should, first of all, be across the curriculum, not just biology, but you get sort of across the curriculum, across the sciences. And second, they should be about the nature of science, about the history of science, about the methods of science, that kind of stuff. That would be, first of all, more interesting for the students. Second of all, have a much longer, more important sort of effect on things. And perhaps you can get somebody interested in the pedagogy of science to teach those kind of things, and they would do a good job. But as far as I know, very, very few colleges actually do that sort of stuff. Of course, I would argue that that kind of course should be taught way before college, at very least in high school. So that, I think, is in terms of science literacy, I think that's a major, that is the most, if I could change one thing, that would be it. That would be the one.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, guys, looks like we're done. Thanks very much for coming.